what we'll do today is get more into practical strategies. Um, and I guess from a rule of thumb point of view, again, it's I'm so aware that behavior and behavior management is infinitely more complex than a lot of what I've sort of spoken about so far. But I think it's good to have jumping off points, rule of thumbs, heuristics, to almost stop the idea of how do I figure out this kid and their behavior and what I do feeling so overwhelming. And sometimes we could ask ourselves these sort of basic questions as a beginning point. So, in terms of do I want to see this behavior again? Is it appropriate or neutral, or is it disruptive? And if a child uses an appropriate behavior, what are the ways? This is what we'll be speaking about today. What are some of the things I can do to provide reinforcement immediately and enthusiastically? And then if a behavior is disruptive, I don't want to see it again. How do I remove reinforcement quickly and consistently? So there are sort of rules of thumbs that we're sort of basically dividing behaviors into these two groups, and then strategies for how we increase one and how we reduce the other. So what I'm going to spend a lot of sort of time coming back to is this idea that your attention is powerful. And it really comes back to what we spoke about in our first workshop, that you're very important people in your students' lives. And we all see that. We see, you come in and they want to talk to you, and they're, pushing each other out of the way to be the first one that you speak to. So your attention is very powerful. And what I often will speak about with parents is how we need to be really deliberate in what we give our attention to, and sort of most importantly, what doesn't earn our attention. And if we start thinking about our attention as this precious privilege, what are the ways that we can use that to our advantage to start seeing more of the positive behaviors? But when we think about attention, we'll often talk about a ratio. So kids need to have 5 bits of positive attention, whatever that looks like. Looking at them, talking to them, giving them a thumbs up, making eye contact, getting on their level, any of the things that you can sort of throw out in the ring that can be used to define giving attention. We talk about how this ratio needs to be 5 to 1. So 5 bits of positive attention to 1 bit of attention for behaviors we don't want to see, whether that's needing to redirect them, whether that's needing to provide a consequence, whether that is just giving a facial expression or a gesture that indicates that what they had done is not appropriate, or they need to carry on and do something else. And for most kids, this ratio is very, very easy to achieve. The vast majority of time, they're doing appropriate behaviors so we can sort of make it rain positive bits of attention. But for our kids who are classic PCIT kids, who are the ones who get recruited into a program like School PCIT, this ratio is much harder to achieve because they're often doing things that require them to be redirected or to be told not to do that or to do something else, or to give them a consequence for breaking some sort of rule or hurting somebody. And so we almost need to be even more deliberate then in attempting to achieve this ratio. Because if this is like, 5 bits of attention for this behavior, then what is that? 25 bits of attention for positive things, which is really hard to do. And so what I'm going to talk about is little things that we can do in sort of a play context, but also just sort of unstructured generally, including structured times as well, that can provide those little bits of attention for behaviors that are appropriate or neutral, basically behaviors that aren't destructive. So this is what we're going to keep coming back to, that way, how do we achieve this ratio, particularly for kids who are often disruptive? So we'll be seeing this little pyramid quite a lot as we move through this workshop and the next. And much like a classic food pyramid, the idea is that we do the things that are down the bottom of the pyramid the most often and save the stuff that's up the top for when we really need it. These are our fun foods, the sugars and the fats, although, less fun strategies. I think it's more fun to do the stuff down the bottom, to do your leafy greens, etc. But that's the idea, basically, that we use the ones down the bottom the most and less frequently as we move up. And what we'll talk about today, the first thing we're going to talk about is this idea of pride skills. So To introduce pride skills, each of the letters, it's an acronym, stands for a different skill. And so I'll talk about each of these ones in turn. But the first thing I'm going to do is try and do, I guess, a bit of a sell about why I'm going to be spending the amount of time that I am on these skills. And at the heart of these skills is the idea that it's a very active way to strengthen a student teacher relationship. So they are at the heart, they're play therapy skills. So they're the types of skills that somebody like me who does a lot of play therapy uses to establish and then strengthen a really warm, trusting, and secure relationship with the child, which we have spoken about briefly, but we'll touch on again now, is super important, those positive student teacher relationships, for a number of reasons. The first being that when you try and do behavior management strategies with a student with whom you have a good quality, strong, trusting relationship, it's going to work better just on average. That attachment relationships are very important in child development, but we know that some of our kids who struggle the most are often the least likely to have really healthy attachment relationships at home. We spoke about that last time. And there's actually quite a bit of science now that has followed kids up through their schooling years and have found that if those kids have really positive relationships with one or a couple of their teachers, that's incredibly protective. They go on to have better outcomes compared to kids in the same position but who didn't have those good relationships. So whether or not you experience that as a bit of pressure or you experience that as sort of an indication of how important and valuable your role is, the science is pretty clear that that relationship you have with these students is incredibly important. Um, from a child point of view, being in an environment with an adult or, lots of adults who use these types of skills is such a powerful tool for making that child feel calm, feel safe, and feel as if they are understood, and that the adult is not only interested in them, but is really willing to understand who they are as people. Um, and it can be a really powerful way of helping kids sort of, often our kids who are the most disruptive can sometimes be the kids who have sort of the lowest self-esteem, sort of like this little deflated balloon. And when we interact with children in the way that I'll speak about in a second, it can sort of serve to blow up that little deflated self-esteem balloon. And, rather than always hearing about the things that they're not doing well or the things that they're doing that is wrong, they're starting to hear more. There's more of a balance. That ratio is starting to sort of be where we want it to be. There's more of a balance where they start seeing themselves as someone who can, you know, listen well, who's someone who can be caring, someone who is a good builder, whatever the characteristic is that kids bring to the table. As well as their social skills, really nice way to build up, like what we spoke about before, that idea of taking turns in conversation. That can be that can be a goal that we could work on using these skills. More broadly, then, we have a set of strategies we can use to enhance or to strengthen or to shift the kind of classroom climate a little bit, which I think is pretty exciting as well. So, when do we use practice? So, traditionally, because they're play therapy skills, we would use them in sort of like a free play, unstructured play, child led play situation, because at their heart, these skills are all about letting the child take the lead and following the child's lead in the play. That's almost like the basic skill that undermines all of these things. And the time where it's safe to let a 5, 6, 7, 8 year old take the lead is in play. Not necessarily when they're crossing roads, catching buses, figuring out when to take a bath or eat dinner. That's not the time where it's safe for them to take the lead, but in play, they can. We can also use this outside of play though. So, like I said, when we're teaching them new skills, new behaviors, these can be very, very useful for encouraging that new learning, um, and just sort of in unstructured time generally when we're, lining up to walk to the library, using these skills to promote that classroom climate and that positive student-teacher relationship. And the last one that I put here is as a possibly, because I'm a realist, I live in the real world. And I know this isn't always feasible or even desirable. But what we've done with some of the kids who have gone through the PCIT program, where there's been a real breakdown in the relationship between student and classroom teacher, which often happens, as we've spoken about, these kids are often hard to like, and that relentlessness of their disruptive behavior can put a real strain on the relationship. So what we've done with some kids is set up a situation where we do sort of a 5-minute one-on-one daily child-led play situation where the teacher's gone really hard at trying to use the pride skills in that setting with that kid to strengthen up that relationship. And what it did was, it's high effort, obviously, to find that 5 minutes and to do a one-on-one when you have a classroom, of 29 other kids. But it seemed in the situations where I've done it, to pay dividends when there was then much less effort and energy and time expended to manage that kid's behavior, in classroom situations. So I put it there as a possibility to take up or not as you see fit. So to get into the specifics of the skills, the first one we'll talk about is praise, which I'm aware that teachers do better than most, if not the best. And we sort of all know how we would define praise and some of the benefits of praise. Obviously, where when we praise a kid, we're showing that we approve of something that they've done, produced, whatever. It's a really good way of trying to get that ratio, balancing out those positive to negative interactions, and very powerfully sort of puffs up that student-teacher relationship. So in PCIT land, we will talk about two different types of praise, which we refer to as unlabeled and labeled, but in other worlds, descriptive, non-descriptive, specific, general, whatever. And obviously, when we talk about sort of non-specific or unlabeled praise, it isn't it's not hanging a tag on a specific behavior. It just shows approval in general. So something like, you did such a good job today. You're perfectly behaved today. Really good work. Awesome job. Those sorts of things. And they are powerful, particularly with older kids and other adults. That sort of praise can work really, really well. It gives you the warm and the fuzzies. But what we find is that when a behavior happens that we really, really like, we almost want to give the praise something to hang its hat on. And so not only we do the awesome, the good work, we also include the specific behavior we're looking for. And at the start, when I said, when we're talking about the behaviors we want to see more of, and it's like, okay, so how do we distill that down to its observable behaviors? This is where that sort of process becomes really useful. So we have a goal where we want a kid to become more caring, more empathic. Those things may mean something to us as adults, being caring, being thoughtful, showing empathy, but to a 5, 6, 7-year-old, that is probably pretty meaningless. And so we want to figure out ways to define those concepts, I guess, using behaviors. And then if we see that behavior happen, we want to label it. So beautiful job waiting your turn in that conversation. Beautiful job waiting for Harry to finish speaking before you spoke. Like those sorts of very sort of, we're almost trying to set up this kid for success and give them the best chance possible of doing the things we want them to do more. So not only does a labeled praise give the warm and the fuzzies, which is good, we like that, it's also a teaching tool, which hopefully will increase how likely we are to see that specific behavior again. So we can use this for the really good stuff. We want to try and deliver it, as close in time as possible to the positive behavior. This isn't always possible. For younger kids, we try and do this more because, they'll just move on and things will just fall out of their brains pretty quickly. But as kids get older, you can kind of go, hey, you remember when you did X, Y, and Z? It was a really nice job of X, Y, and Z. But yeah, try and, as close in time as possible. Deliver it enthusiastically. I'm going to pin this here and not going to talk about it because we'll talk about it more when we talk about the E skill. We want to sort of make it rain when we're trying to teach new behaviors. So I have a really low bar for praise. And, I think from the outside could be accused of, over praising or using too much praise or being too sort of liberal. And I've come up against that quite a bit, speaking to other professionals where it's like, you're taking the kids who least deserve the praise or are behaving in a way that is least praiseworthy, and you're just sort of making you're trying to find anything to praise. And it is about balancing that ratio, balancing those interactions, but also these kids aren't going to if the goal is up here, these kids aren't hitting that goal up there. We almost need to make it really graded, and I'm going to start praising down here and then work my way up to what the ultimate goal is, right? So using it liberally when we can, and obviously, like I said, then tailoring it to where the kid is currently at, and trying, if the goal is to wait patiently until somebody is finished speaking, do we give a praise at an attempt at that, of not immediately interrupt, whatever that looks like. So we can sometimes use positive forecasting in a really powerful way. So this is when we praise in combination with letting the kid know what will happen if they keep doing the behavior that we're praising, right? So, for example, great reading today. Keep practicing hard like this. You'll be able to read a whole chapter by yourself soon. So we're highlighting what the end point is going to be, um, what the ultimate goal is. Um, but I guess again, crucially, the kid has to care about this outcome for this to be reinforcing. Remember, a reinforcer is only defined by the effect it has on the child's behavior. So if we say this sort of praise and forecasting, the behavior isn't affected by that, then it doesn't count as reinforcement because the child hasn't experienced it as a good thing. So we have to sort of again tailor all of our praises and our positive forecasting to what the child cares about, what's important to them, because that's where the motivation then to do it again will come in. Um, we can also use proximal praise with the caveat that we want to be careful about how the timing and the sort of the nature of how we do this. So this is when we praise strategically a different child who's doing the behaviors we want to see more of, right? So this kid is doing off-task behaviors or touching things that they're not meant to be touching, blah blah blah. And then we praise the kids around them by saying, good job keeping your hands to yourself, Tracy, hoping then that is going to be a teaching tool for the kid in the middle. Once again, the caveat being that kids are pretty clever and they can often be quite attuned to what's going on. We don't want this kid to interpret a proximal praise almost as a backhanded or subtle insult or criticism of them. I don't think proximal praise is always interpreted like that. I just think there's more of a risk for this one than others. But I think we can use it really powerfully still, particularly when we're trying to use, a strategic ignoring approach for a particular kid, because they're doing something we don't like. We can sort of almost shift their behavior by using a proximal praise for somebody close to them. And like I said before, we want to have a low bar and try and find even small or minor attempts to behave in appropriate ways, that we can then give a label praise to. So trying to keep hands to self might be something that we do. So that's P for praise. And like I said, obviously this is a play skill. We can be using this in play. Oh my gosh, you're such a good builder. I love how you've matched all the colors of your tower. But all of the examples we just spoke about then were examples that we would use in teaching time or sort of even unstructured, just sort of moving around the classroom time, transition times, whatever. So really sort of across context skill, the old praise, as we know.